coming of the Europeans. Very few people talk about this subject from an African point of view, because the coming of the Europeans, not only to Africa, but the coming of the Europeans to the world was disaster. And yet, when you read the history books, the assumption is that the coming of the Europeans was the bringing of the light. And yet, everywhere he went in the world, he put out the light. He brought no civilization to anybody, anywhere, any place in the world.
In the 16th century, there were different factions of Europeans battling against the royal hierarchy control of England. Since their inception after the Middle Ages, Europeans have always violently turned on each other for differences in culture, beliefs, religious views, and the simplest regards of power structures. The development of slavery plantations was a business decision. Although malevolent in its purpose, it was a brilliant idea, yet grossly savage towards humanity. England and Spain held a connection to the Roman Catholic Church. The King of England at the time was Henry VIII, and he was married to Catherine of Aragon. This was the only connection the king had with the Roman Church, as Catherine was the aunt of King Charles V of Spain, who was a staunch ally of the Holy Roman Empire. King Henry severed his ties with Rome completely and named himself the head of the Church of England so he could also divorce Catherine. This sequence of events created a divisive atmosphere throughout Europe and the rulers of the throne to be. Elizabeth, the first heavily ambitious queen, turned a blind eye of the continual reformation of the religious views from the Church of England. She allowed her naval fleet under infamous naval captain Sir Francis Drake crash and plunder Spain's merchant and treasure ships, annihilating the Spanish Armada. This fueled the tensions even more with Spain and also crippled their colonial stronghold in the Netherlands as well as the Caribbean. After the reign of Queen Elizabeth, the Church of England began a great shift. This is when James VI of Scotland united his homeland with England, in which he became the infamous King James. King James held Protestant religious values and was the driving force in changing the views of religious traditions throughout England and Britain. Slavery at this time was already sanctioned into the Roman Catholic Church 100 years or so prior. However, King James wanted his version of the Holy Book to produce his religious idea to his country. He understood how powerful religion and how controlling it was to a mass amount of people. This started a great division within the citizens of England, in which many different subsections of religion such as Lutheranism, Catholicism, Calvinism, Protestantism, and so forth became active belief systems. King George II of Britain was dealing with a large number of issues as the French and the Spanish was collecting colonies in the New World and the Caribbean. The king was finding ways to sustain his country's position as well as benefit from the explorations of the new colonies. There is different passages stating that the British sent up to 200,000 prisoners to the colony of Georgia named after their king. They called these prisoners indentured servants, but they really were prisoners where most of them couldn't gain their freedoms or passage to the New World until after 7 or 14 years of enslavement. And these was all white people. We must understand that there were English white prisoners who first was brought to the United States under orders of persecution from the king to the slaves in the New World. When King George II took rule of the crown after wars with the French and Spanish, England was dealing with famines and diseases, overpopulation, and an overcrowded prison community. You then had the Quakers, originally from Lancashire, England, who held strong beliefs that differed from the Church of England. Persecuted Irishmen, the Dutch, the French, all were in search of new opportunities. Some were granted to set sail, others fled for the New World for resettlement. avoided persecution from the throne, Puritans also set sail away from the religious sanctions from the crown. These people despised the doctrines King James declared that now permeated throughout ancient Europe. The Quakers in time became political revolutionaries with intentions to overthrow the government of England. These Puritans also formed with the Pilgrims were intent on getting what they wanted. Spain controlled Florida, Mexico, and parts of Texas. The French controlled the Louisiana area up into Middle America through Canada. The Dutch moved in the northern colonies. The British settled in the Chesapeake Bay and surrounding areas. Again, all this developed because Europeans was turning on one another for their own selfish and savage reasons. Okay, so you have the Puritans and the Pilgrims, and they're in the New England area, the Quakers in Pennsylvania, and the King George-led Brits with their prisoners turned slaves in the southern eastern seaboard such as Georgia and the Carolinas. This is a point in history where a lot of confusion and fictional accounts was embedded in the average American through schooling and mass propagandized education systems. The Founding Fathers' ideology and vision for America was sparked on aristocracy-led people wanting full conquest of a land for themselves. These settlers began to explore the new land for resources and riches. They initially was in search for gold. They were unsuccessful in that attempt. Yet they had to feed themselves and manage their health. These Englishmen did not know how to fish, hunt the foreign land, gather livestock, or farm. They were of the aristocratic society, or what we call bougie today. Naturally, knowing if you can't find your main resource, which was gold, you must find something else of value. The colonists were in a state of disarray and desperation as they were dying of disease, famines, pestilence, malnourishment, and starvation. Over decades, the colonists learned they could not survive the foreign land as they began to discover crops akin to tobacco, indigo, sugar, rice, coffee, and of course cotton. This was their new goal. Land became their newest conquest. The problems they faced with acquiring land was the Indians, whom were relentless to give up their land to the colonists. This caused war in which the English eventually won. Using Indian prisoners of war as slaves to crop their fields alongside whites, it was quickly realized they were not physically built for such a daunting task. Deaths from various diseases such as malaria, yellow fever, smallpox prevented the colonists from reaching mass harvesting, which slowed their production massively. The transatlantic slave trade involved more shipping of white English slaves than black slaves. The same was true for the 200,000 English Georgia prisoners who slaved for the right to be American citizens. The Europeans had some clever tricks up their sleeve, very manipulative and extremely conniving. These people were all about self. It was no such thing as equal. It never has, it never was. Have you ever had someone befriend you? They become a good friend, they seem cool, they learn from you, they absorb your persona and your skills, and as soon as they feel like they don't need you anymore, they cut you completely off. That is what the colonists did with the Indians, except they killed them off. Instead of cutting them off, they killed them off. This is a European trait and characteristic. And a lot of us have this trait mainly from living in this European incubator we call America. A lot of the ills in the African American community are inherited traits of Europeans. Homosexuality, bestiality, domestic violence, teen pregnancy, male chauvinism, structured religions are all European origins transplanted into the culture of America. Racism. Where did this social construct come from? How did it become so ingrained into the fabric of the American consciousness? As the burgeoning of cash crops became the equivalent of gold to numerous settlers, the illicit intentions now was to expand as much as possible. This meant acquiring more land through violent means and more sustainable labor. POW Indians and indentured whites couldn't survive the fields from dusk to dawn. They couldn't survive the physical backbreaking of the required labor needed to mass produce rice, tobacco, sugar, indigo, turpentine, cotton, lumber, livestock, furs, and so forth. America was turned into an industrial haven in the north and a plantation nation in the south. It was not the crops that was gold. It was the labor of the black slave that was worth more than gold. Blacks were the only human who could provide the necessary labor to make a small plantation owner wealthy. This was the beginning of black slaves being targeted as value. Africans were not the first slaves in this country. We must understand that. Whites, they called indentured servants who fled Europe for a better life, and prisoners of war Indians were the first to be slaved for the labor force in America, years before the introduction of Africans. An African for slave labor was very, very expensive at this time. The first documented account of African slaves entering into America was in 1619, and it was only 20 of them supplied. These slaves were not brought directly from Africa. They were instead brought from the Caribbean islands. We were taught the transatlantic slave trade engineered the transport of millions of Africans into the fold of the Americans and the Caribbean. But that narrative is not aligned with documented facts or naval schematics during that time period. The transatlantic slave trade produced just as many whites as there were blacks. The settlers were hell-bent on structuring their religious ideologies on their own people by force. If you didn't believe in Jesus, which was structurally a new deity, you were killed. These atrocities were written in the Act of Toleration, signed as law in 1649. This was the beginning of the indoctrination of Jesus and Christianity in America as its chief religion.
For 700 years now, he's been in Europe, feeding on Europeans. He has not enslaved the African principally because he has been enslaving Europeans under a form of slavery that he called feudalism. Strong Europeans have taken the land and enslaved other Europeans to work the land. The biggest landowner in Europe is the church.
Racism in Europe, Rome, Spanish, and African countries was not a development. If that was the case, Rome would not have had black emperors like Septimus Severus or Caracalla. England would not have had King James or his son Charles II, which his nickname is well known as the Black Boy. If it was a racist agenda in those countries, there wouldn't have been these rulers as well as many black citizens. Moroccans, Africans, or Moors, what we call them today, from Northern Africa, moved into these various countries and brought education, mathematics, economics, spirituality, and so forth. We were all around the globe teaching and developing nations with other people besides our own. This is why they truly fled for the New World. They wanted to rule and conquer for themselves. In revenge, they wanted to subjugate the Negro and the black people of the world by culture raping us all and fracturing our historical integrity completely. And they have been very, very successful. Development of race as a means to, without question, judge negatively of a person because of their skin color became an intricate, effective tool. They called it the slave codes. The slave codes were a set of laws shared by Europeans that were strictly meant to subjugate the black man, woman, and their offspring as a slave for the rest of their lives. All based on the idea that if you didn't believe in Jesus, you were not worthy of being honored as a human. These laws decided the status and servitude of black people in the country before and after the American Revolutionary War. We were allowed to read and write. Slave owners were allowed to kill, flog, and beat their slaves. Blacks couldn't be employed privately for earned wages. We weren't allowed to wear garments of a finer cloth. These were slave codes. Now, you have to come into the fact that we were not speaking the English language. So we didn't understand these laws at all because we did not understand the language. See, so by us not understanding the language, we can't understand the Christianity faith or Jesus because we didn't understand their language. We had to be taught their language in order to adhere to what they wanted us to do. All of this was systematically forced upon us. The United States was becoming a full independence while knowing the builders of this country would come off the backs of black people. These slave codes over time morphed into the black codes in the 1800s, and the black codes morphed into the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment in the Constitution. Then those spawned the Jim Crow laws in the 1900s, and that morphed into the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s. We have to put these pieces together. We have to. Now today, racism is so abstract, it's embedded in the laws. Now that we hardly understand their language, that means we still haven't mastered the customs, but have adopted their culture completely. We don't pay attention enough. We do not pay enough attention to the importance of our liberation, which keeps us stagnant in life, comfortable with the mere trinkets of living in an oppressed society.
The Africans live for the totality, the collectiveness of the whole society. And the Europeans live for the meanness of the individual in the society. This is why every time you see a piece of European art, you see somebody's name under it. And yet the Benin art of Africa, there's nobody's name. Who created the Benin art? The great art of Egypt, the great river art of the Niger. Because the art was created for the whole people. And when you see the folk philosophy and the folk tales of Africa, all of these things are told and put down, not for individuals, but for an entire people.
Given that there were hundreds of thousands of white poor indentured slaves who were physically unable to farm, cultivate, and harvest their crops, this job now belonged to the indentured native blacks and the scattered Africans brought in from the Caribbean, which wasn't a lot. History has us to believe that millions of slaves from the coast of Africa were shipped here to serve under those slave codes. That was far from the truth. From the mid-1700s to the 1800s, there were over 500 treaties signed amongst native blacks and Europeans to stop the bloodshed wars of our people. Our native ancestors agreed to work alongside the Europeans in exchange for future land grants and peace. We agreed to be enslaved, thinking we were in a working relationship. But in actuality, we were tricked over and over, as all of these treaties were not upheld. This is over 500 treaties that were not upheld by the early settlers and founding fathers. This stalling allowed the burst of plantation life to flourish in the southern states, Jacksonville specifically. Prior to and after the American Revolutionary War, which stemmed from Puritans and Pilgrims turning on the British, the plantation grid in the 13 colonies had begun. For centuries to come, America and the black indigenous natives would be the builders of this country, the Plantation Nation. The white prisoners sent from England to Georgia became the poor class of Europeans as they populated and struggled on their own to produce a life and future for themselves. Some would become farmers, some would marry a black slave or a Paleo Indian. Others would work under slave owners as the slave master or even the bounty hunters for runaways. They called them the police then. Jacksonville settled with over 100 plantations, small, medium, large, German, Irish, English, and black owners. Slaveholders are memorialized all over our city for street names, bridges, parks, and even government buildings. The history is all around you. We can mention the various slave owners who held their own cash crop plantations and the various developments as the Red Bank, New Switzerland, the Hermitage, the Turner, the Cecilton, the Skinner, the Setonia. All were local, lucrative plantations. That's not even the half. We're going to concentrate in an area of important historical value pertaining to plantation life in Jacksonville, Florida. Today we call this area Arlington.
We are currently at the Ready Point Preserve location at the northernest part of Greater Arlington area. This is just off of University Boulevard. Throughout Florida history from the 16th century, Spain claimed the colony of Florida. Before the United States took control of this area in 1821, the English held rule from 1763 to 1783. Now, during this 20-year period in 1769, English Captain William Ready purchased this 1,800-acre tract of land where I'm currently sitting. Although only in the area for 20 years as the Spanish reclaimed the colony, Captain Ready provided the early settlement and clearing of the land for provisional crops, naval stores, and farming, naming this area Point Plantation and Hampstead Plantation. This entire area was settled by black Indians, some who were friendly to the white settlers and others who weren't. Now, let's fast forward to the Francis Richard family. Mr. Francis Richard, who fled France after murdering a man, was granted a few land tracts in this area. Mr. Francis documented in his writing that he held 38 total slaves. Now, Mr. Richard would go on to operate the first water-powered sawmill, which was in what we today call Strawberry Creek. The Richard family would merge in a working relationship with Anna Kingsley and her mulatto family, as the son-in-law of the Kingsley fold, John Sammons, was the chief operator of the sawmill of Strawberry Creek. Now, this area later would become the McNeil Plantation. Charles McNeil was a black man, and his wife Elizabeth Coffey was a black woman, and they both was free. They raised 9 children and protected their black laborers, but historical texts will say they were slaves. This area would become a free black working community, the first free black working community in Jacksonville. Now let's talk about Anna Kingsley, the wife of Zephaniah Kingsley of the Kingsley Plantation. We all know from text she was a mulatto princess from Senegal, Africa, purchased in Cuba. After the death of her husband and eldest son, Anna chose to resettle in the Arlington area to be closer to other blacks. She even brought her former slaves with her after her husband and eldest son died. I'm now at what was known as the St. Isabel Plantation. It's now called the Blue Cypress Park. It is also on University Boulevard in Arlington. Orrin Baxter, an English New Yorker, and his wife Martha, the mulatto daughter of Anna Kingsley, operated this plantation under the same guidelines as the McNeil Plantation, which was at Ready Point, and that is right next door. So they basically were neighbors. What we fail to know is that Anna Kingsley used her prominence and her influence to help the indigenous blacks of the area avoid the harsh mistreatment of enslavement from the colonists. The free black community of Arlington was getting bigger and were developing under the steely guide of Anna Kingsley and her daughter, Martha Kingsley. Martha, again, a black woman, became one of the 10 wealthiest residents in Duval County at the time. These heroines were great, I'm talking great businesswomen. Anna lived in between both of her daughters in what was called the Chesterfield Plantation, which is now parts of the Jacksonville University campus. Although Martha was married to Orrin Baxter, Anna's younger daughter, Mary, was married to John Sammis. Sammis operated and eventually owned the Strawberry Creek Sawmill, several orange groves, rice fields, indigo fields, and a lot of different provisional crops in the area. You can see the outlining of the areas where the fields were obviously cleared. Anna Jive first came into prominence when Zephaniah Kingsley brought her to his Fort George plantation from Cuba. Everyone who is a native of Jacksonville should know and have visited the Kingsley Plantation on Fort George Island. We could not locate one official picture of the heroine, nor her husband or children. This is quite strange, being that they were very wealthy and photographs of the area and their slaves during their time period was available. Being from Senegal descent, it could be very well true that Anna was a very dark complected woman. But we will never know. Adjacent to the Chesterfield was the Bacon Place area, operated by Robert Bigelow and the Bigelow family. They described this tract of land as the Bacon Place, but it indeed was also a plantation and more than likely other provisional crops. The Bigelows was known for their land to be surrounded by orange groves. There are still many orange trees in the area today. We went to the Bigelow area now named Floral Bluff Road. We spoke to various residents where surprisingly more of them knew the history of the Bigelows and others were not as privy. We were pointed to two different cemeteries. The first is the Bigelow's private cemetery. Robert Bigelow is noted as an intelligent man. Being a graduate of Yale in the 18th century, he was known to be just and fair in his beliefs and dealings. He operated a ferry dock and was in the merchant business as well. It is also noted Mr. Bigelow owned slaves but treated them exceptionally well. Arlington was dominated by a black movement of families sticking together, believing in unity while avoiding the misfortunes of a racial society. Anna Kingsley could be credited and recognized for her work and brilliance. We also must understand the Arlington area officially didn't become a part of Jacksonville until 1953 after the construction of the Matthews Bridge. The Matthews Bridge construction reshaped the landscape of Jacksonville in many ways. In 1920, more black women were registering to vote than white women. Mr. John Matthews specifically addressed to his white constituents the magnitude of the threat with these words: "The washerwoman and cooks may hold the balance of the power. This is a white man's country and government. His by right of conquest, by right of might, by right of blood he has spilled, and by right of the brain and energy to its building and development." This is the same man who the Matthews Bridge was dedicated and named after. If we go further along south of the river, we come to the main tract of Arlington called the Clifton Plantation. To this day, the main street in this location is named Clifton. This was the site of episode 1 of Duval hanging. This was also the second cemetery site we visited. Mary Kingsley, the daughter of Anna, was married to a white up-and-coming businessman named John Sammis. He operated the Strawberry Hill sawmill where he merchant cedar, pine, and oak lumber. Not only did he have seacoast cotton and rice fields, Mr. Sammis was a headstrong entrepreneur. Most of the Sammis family and Mary Kingsley is buried in the old cemetery dedicated to the people who forged this area. You can feel the spirit surround you heavily. It's an eerie pull that isn't euphoric or melancholy. The John S. Sammis house is still standing and is in the National Register of Historic Places. The Clifton Cemetery is nearby the home of Mr. Sammis, where plenty of the relatives are buried, including heroines Anna and Mary Kingsley. From reading several accounts of Mr. Sammis, I am not sure if he was a kind man or tolerant to blacks, as he was the largest slave owner in the area. He is also on record for selling all of his slaves in a New Orleans slave auction. Although married to Anna Kingsley's daughter, the Clifton Plantation is accredited for a lot of bad towards blacks than good. I'm standing at the embankment of Arlington Creek. It connects to the Arlington River, and the Arlington River connects to the Clifton Plantation, which they call Strawberry Hill or the Strawberry Bluff or the Floral Bluff. They have a lot of different names of it where John Sammis was located at. I just showed you the house. Now, what they used to do when they used to take their runaway slaves, or they capture their runaway slaves, or they had orders from the court to hang a certain person because of execution date or whatever the case. If you watch episode 1, you would have noticed that Celia was hung at the Clifton Plantation. Being that they had to have gallows and hanging structures to be able to hang criminals or hang runaway slaves or whatever the black codes that they were going by at this time. They brought the runaway slaves here and they hung them. And they used the creek as the transportation to get them here. This is just part of the history that is in Arlington that I have dug into and have found out. We have to know these certain things to understand the historical and cultural integrity that we have. Otherwise, we'll still be lost and we will not understand what type of people we are. The black community of Arlington stretches more than these few plantations we have mentioned. A lot of the former families of slaves and freedmen developed in an area named Cosmo and Fulton. These neighborhoods were strictly black communities that today has been renamed Fort Caroline. Arlington should be considered the first free black community that was once occupied and developed through the means of laborious enslavement. This area should be respected for such determination of our ancestors, even though today it is a wide example of European conquest. Let me give you an example. People of color have been the receiver of many derogatory names based on our skin tone, from colored, Negro, Stoer, Moors, Mullion, nigger, and so forth. The Spanish also had their own word to describe us. This word was cimarron. Cimarron was a word given to runaway cattle or livestock that couldn't be tamed, or in other terms, the runaway slave. The word was then used to describe indigenous blacks of Florida, and where maroon, as in the color, described their skin tone. The Creek Indians translated the word as Seminole. The Seminoles, predominantly black, was so valuable to other indigenous tribes in Florida, as they were the largest, because they were the only ones who could speak different languages as translators, but who were also the most skillful at war strategies. Seminoles are not an Indian tribe contrary to popular belief. Seminoles are a distinct people like Germans or Russians or Jamaicans. I want to gather your attention closely on what I am about to reveal to you. We gave you the details of the Clifton Plantation hanging gallows, but I want to show you how that area is still being memorialized as a place for European conquest. I have lived in Jacksonville the majority of my life, and for some years, the Arlington area specifically. Until the research of this project, I never knew what Cimarron meant and probably didn't care. That was my ignorance. Every residential complex on Arlington Expressway has changed their names several times over during the years, but not this particular complex. This is not coincidence. This is deliberate. This is an utter display of memorializing the past savagery of Europeans over blacks. The name of runaway slaves, Cimarron, represents this residential complex on the same land that runaway slaves were put to death. That is the demoralization of blacks. Europeans for centuries pay homage to their conquest with names and memorials so they can always remember their history of savagery and control. This plantation nation was created to grow throughout the years, transforming into other more strategic means of enslavement. I want to end this episode on a thought that you need to embrace. Europeans memorialize what they are proud of, and on the other hand, Europeans demoralize what they conquered. To pay homage to their plantation conquest and control, Europeans honor the names of other Europeans who hunted the prey and conquered them. The Ready Point, the Clifton, Pottsburg, Lem Turner Road, Isaiah D. Hart Bridge, Matthews Bridge, and even the name Jacksonville alone are simple examples of memorializing Europeans who demoralized blacks. When you see a Martin Luther King Boulevard in any city, it's in a black danger zone. When you see names of parks or schools of black historians, they're usually underfunded and in impoverished black neighborhoods. Some of these black heroes we have were victims of European conquest, either political, social, or civil. Europeans do not and never have honored blacks. When we believe they are memorializing our black historians when they name a school or a street or they erupt a statue in our ancestors' name, but in truth, they are demoralizing them. I was once told an analogy that fits the European concept called the hunter and the prey. Europeans hunt for the prey they desire. They wait, they prepare, they strategize. Once they have found that prey and placed them in the most vulnerable, least expecting position, they go for the kill shot. The European then feels proud for conquering his prey. He celebrates. He wants that feeling and memory of killing the innocent and defenseless to last forever. He needs an item of that conquest to keep that memory everlasting. This is him memorializing his conquest forever. America is and will always be a plantation nation.
And the rain starts falling. I'll protect you, I will catch you, I won't let you fall down. I swear that I'll be there when there's no one around. It gets real deep, but I won't let you drown. Cause we all we got. Cause we all we got. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cause we all we got. Cause we all we got. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cause we all we got. Cause we all we got. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cause we all we got. Cause we all we got. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's my nigga. That's my brother. That's my dog. We been ballin', homie. Y'all Scobie. Y'all just kicking all best of buds. Same hood since we been small, saving allowances, cupping them ounces, but we devolve. I don't really eat pork, but I go ham about left. Y'all don't really want war, so just marching left, right, left. See, I try not to be violent, but y'all liable to get jumped on. No ice bucket, nigga still might get dumped on. So, nigga, what's wrong? Please change up your tone so we won't feel pre-squared to do an invasion in your home. Left kids like my kids, cause we just like family. If ever you not around, I hold them down. Gravity, family is about love. Pause, no homo, we'll be side by side, G to G, Gucci logo. Yeah, bro, we know Migos, I ain't talking about no rappers. We know real amigos, Mexican traffickers. Stay on top of my math, cause my brain work like an abacus. And when we blow it's magic, abracadabra.